All right, well, welcome to the Pacific Northwest Historians Guild's monthly meeting. And these monthly meetings, for those of you who don't know, occur every fourth Thursday of the month, except for July, August, or June, July, August. And in those months, we have summer programs, and we've been talking about what we're going to be doing. So we'll tell you more about that in the future. But for now, this is, I just thought, for those who are not familiar with this is what we've been doing since 1980. And you can learn more about the Guild on our website. You can see that in front of you. And then we also have a Facebook page. So it's good to check us out. Feel free. You can learn all sorts of things about what we're up to. And you can also join the Guild. And it's a very inexpensive thing to do. In return, you get to be attending at all these meetings. And when we have events, you get a discount. For instance, we had the history conference last summer, and I think we had about 180 people show up, and those of attendees who were members got a discount on a number of things. So anyway, that's what it costs to join. And there's also, notice, the lifetime member, and I mentioned that last meeting, and we had 31 lifetime members, and 2 more people joined as a lifetime. So feel free to become a lifetime member. Now, in keeping with our mission, we like to keep people informed about what's going on in local history and different programs that are available. And we just received this from the Book Club of Washington. They are going to have a virtual tour of the collections at the Washington State Library. So there is the link, but you can just look up the Book Club of Washington, and if you want to attend, that's on March 3rd at 2 p.m. It ought to be pretty interesting. Last month, we had a very good presentation. Ann Jenner from the University of Washington Special Collections, Ann Ferguson from Seattle Public Library, and Anna Elam from the Museum of History and Industry. They talked about what's going on in research. What are people doing when they come to the UW and Seattle Public Library and MOHI? What are they looking for? Very interesting. And they talked about the resources that they have available for people. And I think it was very well attended. And we'll have it up on our website soon. We have a recording of it. We're a little delayed. I shouldn't say we're a little delayed. I'm a little delayed getting it up, but we will accomplish that, so you can listen in if you want to. And then, as I mentioned, the fourth Thursday of the month, we have speakers, and the fourth Thursday of March is March 28th. And Danica Miller will be talking about a lawsuit called the City of Tacoma versus Andrus. And it's pretty interesting. It was after the Bolt decision, when Indian rights became very controversial, and the Puyallup tribe took action to secure their rights, and some people in Tacoma didn't think much of that, and they even went as far as to argue in the lawsuit that the Puyallup tribe no longer existed. Which nowadays you hear about that and you think, my gosh, what a gutsy move. But back then, not so much. But people finally realized that the Bolt decision and other decisions establishing Native American rights were here to stay, and rightly so. And so it'll be pretty interesting to hear what Danica has to say. Now, for this meeting and all other meetings, if you have a question for the speaker, just type it in on the chat function. It's down at the bottom of your screen, and just type it in, and then David Williams, who's going to be running the show with our speaker, will read them when our speaker is finished. And so with that, I will get out of the way and let David introduce our speaker, and we'll get the show on the road.
Great, Jim. Thank you. It's an honor and pleasure to be here and have everyone here. So I'd like to do is just give you a short bio about David, and then he will be doing the program with his, what I was heard described as his very trusted friend and a brilliant partner, Darlene, who will be setting up the show and taking care of all of that. So let me tell you a little bit about David if you don't already know who he is. He was director of the Washington State Historical Society from 1987 to 2011. In that capacity, he edited Columbia Magazine, which I'm sure all of you are aware of, and oversaw the funding, design, and construction of the new Washington State History Museum, which opened in downtown Tacoma in 1996, which you haven't been, if you've not been to, you are quite remiss. In recent years, Dave has focused on writing and research, having authored River of Promise, Lewis and Clark on the Columbia, Captain Cook Rediscovered, Voyaging to the Icy Latitudes, and Lewis and Clark Reframed, examining ties to Cook, Vancouver, and Mackenzie. In this talk, he's going to be talking about his new book, Discovering Nothing, which is now in press. And Dave has another volume of essays under consideration by Washington State University Press with the working title From Juan de Fuca to John C. Fremont, Exploring Northwest Geography, Real and Imagined. In researching Dave, I came across this wonderful description of his work. One reviewer wrote, Nicandri brings a welcome iconoclastic twist to the history of discoveries in this quarter. His knowledge is vast, his insights penetrating, his narratives fearless. He writes with simplicity, grace, and clarity, and his book contains that ever so important bite that makes for good history and compelling narrative. So it is my honor to present Dave and let he and Darlene figure out the technology, and we'll go from there. And once again, if you have questions, please type them in the chat at the bottom, and I will be the moderator at the end on the questions. So Dave and Darlene, it's your show.
Okay, thank you, David, for that very nice introduction. And it's a true joy to see so many familiar names and faces signed on for tonight's meeting. I appreciate your presence. A special thanks and an introduction to Darlene Kemery, who is my assistant for these kinds of productions. And I simply couldn't do it without Darlene's help, and I'm ever grateful for her support. So let's get the slideshow started, Darlene, with the first slide. So let me just say this presentation will be much like public television. There will be a brief advertisement at both the beginning and the end of the presentation. As David mentioned, I do have a new book coming out in early May, Discovering Nothing, in Pursuit of an Elusive Northwest Passage. The title of my presentation is actually what I wanted to have as the subtitle, but I've never had a book titled what I wanted it to be. I think I understand my title is too long for a book cover, but it's more descriptive. And almost all of the images you're about to see, and you'll see mostly the images rather than myself, are drawn, will be illustrations in this forthcoming book or have appeared in other books. And I'll have a brief list of those at the end of the presentation. So let me just offer a couple other introductory remarks, and then we'll go to the first slide, which is also the first map. It took about 80 years after the imperial powers encountered North and South America for the resumption of the quest that had sent Columbus first in line into the Southwest Atlantic, looking for a shortcut from Europe to Asia. This, as of course, as we all know from our early, perhaps grade school education, as an alternative route rather than sailing around the far end of Africa, across the Indian Ocean to the Spice Islands and to China for the goods the European powers and commercial adventurers wished to engage. Of course, the imperial conquest of the Western Hemisphere took first priority, but then again, after about 80 years, the quest that sent Columbus southwestward was resumed, although the interposition of North and South America forced a redirection of the search for this fabled shortcut to the Northwest rather than to the Southwest. All of the early efforts in this quest were necessarily from the Atlantic side of North America, and the explorers and the adventurers who led their ventures, their names dominate the cartography of the Canadian Atlantic seaboard. Frobisher, Baffin, Hudson, most famous Davis, most famously Hudson. All of these efforts to find a Northwest Passage, so named because these navigators were looking for a passage over the top of North America, northwest of their home ports. All of these early efforts came to naught and seemed completely stymied by the middle of the 18th century, but at which time word began to filter back to the European capitals that the Russian fur traders had extended across to the full extent of the Russian Far East and were making geographic discoveries in what we would now know as the Aleutian chain and the Alaska mainland. In 1753, not merely the Russian fur traders, but also their more practiced explorers, principally Bering and Chirikov, word of these voyages began to filter back to the European capitals and geographers located therein. And the always hazy early depictions of North America began to take on greater shape. So our first map here, published in 1753, was based on the projection of a famous French cartographer by the name of Philippe Bouache. The most prominent aspect of this image, and it's right in the center of the projection, is the Mer de l'Ouest. This was a favorite fantastical notion that French cartographers were particularly fond of. That is to say, a Pacific inlet, an inlet off of the Pacific, not only equal to, but in fact greater in size and scope than Hudson Bay that you can see off to the northeast, the upper right corner of this image. Other aspects worthy of note: California is a peninsula, and to the north of the Mer de l'Ouest, you see a hazy network of lakes and rivers that were imagined to be a system by which one might make path from Hudson Bay westward to the North Pacific. Completely fantastical notion, but this was the state of cartographic play in the immediate aftermath of the Russian trade and exploratory voyages in the North Pacific in the middle of the 18th century. Next slide. The last map published prior to Captain Cook's third voyage of exploration, the first two, of course, concentrated in the southern hemisphere. Voyage 1 for the transit of Venus quest at Tahiti, voyage 2 to determine once and for all whether there was a southern continent of the equal mass to the Eurasian landmass. Cook's second voyage, of course, disproved that notion. But when Cook returned in 1775, after that second voyage, this was the last projection of the North Pacific that made it into print. This is the English version, was based upon a Prussian chart, published in the early 1770s. But you can see, in the lower left, you can see the obvious shape of Kamchatka, kind of a readily recognizable Russian Far East, but that assemblage of islands, no doubt an allusion to the Aleutian chain, very hypothetically posed. None of them, or very few of them, extend that far to the west, tucked underneath the Eurasian landmass. And also of particular note, just below what is an intimation of what we all know today as Bering Strait, is the largest of these islands, named Alaska. This was the first time the word Alaska, or a derivation thereof, ever appeared in the English language. So these images, both published, this one published a year before Cook departed, the Bouache derivative image published some 20 years earlier, were the state of geographic knowledge of the North Pacific on the eve of Cook's third voyage. Next slide, please, Darlene. This map is an inset from an even larger map concentrating on the Pacific Basin. The lines that you see crisscrossing the Pacific, perhaps somewhat difficult to see in any detail on the screen in front of you, show the track of Cook over the course of his 3 voyages. One of the among the many noteworthy aspects of this map is that the width of the Pacific Ocean, particularly in the North Pacific, and the general northwesterly trend line of the Northwest coast were cartographically defined with a reasonable degree of accuracy in the wake of Cook's coastal voyage in these neighboring waters in the spring of summer in 1778. You will also note the completely different and contrasting depiction of Alaska, now not merely an island, but a mass of land, again, reasonably projected, certainly on the south and western coast, a mass of land of subcontinental dimension. You'll also see the reasonably accurate juxtaposition of the Far East Cape of Russia, of Asia, and Cape Prince of Wales, named by Cook the most westerly point of the North American landmass. I've called this larger map, of which this inset is taken, the first modern map of the world. Yes, there are errors and inconsistencies. Japan, the Korean Peninsula, the east coast of Australia, New Holland, as it's denominated here, are not entirely realistic. They're not perfectly accurate. But anyone looking at Cook's map would recognize our normative general understanding of the world's geography by looking at it. But again, I want for the purposes of this program, I wish to call attention again to the highlights relative to the Northwest Passage. The general northwesterly trajectory of the mainland, in complete distinction to those 2 earlier images you saw. Cook, of course, failed to find the Northwest Passage. I passed over a point I should have made earlier. After all of those previous failed attempts from the Atlantic side, the British Admiralty, in the wake of Cook's great success on his first 2 voyages, conjured up the notion of, to put it in colloquial terms, if we can't find the Northwest Passage from the Atlantic, let's look for it from the backside of North America by sending the greatest navigator of that time, Captain Cook, to look for it. He was stymied by the ice pack on the northwestern coast of Alaska, just as Frobisher, Davis, Hudson, Baffin, all the rest had been stymied by the ice centuries earlier. Next slide. One of the consequences of Cook's 3rd voyage, and completely inadvertent, was that the men who of his 2 ships who acquired furs at Nootka Sound from the indigenous population there, furs gathered as warm weather gear, since they were about to head into the icy latitudes. This, again, timeline being the spring and summer of 1778. These furs, particularly sea otter pelts, acquired for a pittance on the Northwest coast at Nootka Sound, later at Prince William Sound, and Cook Inlet, were discovered, this is of course after Cook's own death, were discovered by his crew when they reached the Chinese ports on the return in late 1779, 1780. These furs acquired for a pittance on the Northwest coast could sell for a small fortune in the Chinese market. What might have been procured for a nail at Nootka Sound would yield 100 Spanish dollars at Canton, as that port was formerly known. This, of course, as any student of Northwest history would know, precipitated a veritable rush, a rush for the soft gold of sea otter pelts in particular, both from the mainland of North America, that is a push from east to west, and also the visit of many maritime fur traders who followed a prospectus written about the prospects for a maritime fur trade that was written by Lieutenant James King as a supplement to Cook's 3rd voyage account. What you see here is a map authored, in a manner of speaking, by Peter Pond, who was a terrestrial fur trader operating out of Montreal, became one of the principal figures of what became known as the Northwest Company. And he, like many of his counterparts, who were already moving west into the rich fur-bearing districts west of Hudson Bay, once word of Cook's, the find that Cook's men had made on the Northwest coast, imagined being able to create a network, a fur trade network, a form of a Northwest Passage from the Great Lakes through this system of rivers and lakes all the way to the Northwest coast, including an outlet from what we would know as Great Slave Lake, just east of the thin line representing the Western Cordillera, emerging onto the North Pacific Ocean at either Cook Inlet or Prince William Sound there on the left side of the image. This map was published in 1790, 15 or so years after Cook's chart and his account of exploration was published in 1784. Next slide. Now, I've mentioned the maritime fur traders. Of course, they're approaching from an entirely different direction. Indeed, John Gore, who was the commander of the Cook expedition after both Cook and his assistant, Charles Clark, died during the course of Cook's third voyage, John Gore was bringing the ships home when his men made this fantastic commercial discovery. And Gore immediately had to put down an incipient mutiny because so many of the men, having learned what these pelts could procure by way of remuneration, immediately wanted to sail back to the Northwest coast to engage in the fur trade. Gore put that incipient mutiny down. Go back to the previous slide, Darlene, if you could. Gore put that mutiny down, but word spread rapidly in the domain of operations of the East India Company in both India and in the China market. And of course, Cook's account published in 1784 also publicized this commercial prospect. Cook himself was never much of a believer in the possibility of the fur trade. It was his successors who touted it. Now, this chart is from one of the most important of the maritime fur traders who came to the Northwest coast in the wake of Cook's third voyage, and that would be John Mears. Now, to the right and over the top of this image, you can, and this map was published the same year as Pond's map that you saw in the previous slide. You can see that the same intimation of lakes and rivers to the north and west of Lake Superior, going through Great Slave Lake with an outlet alternatively to Prince William Sound or Cook Inlet there in the upper left. But I would call particular attention to the lower left part of this image because among the consequences of the maritime fur traders visiting the Northwest coast is that they discovered a far more intricate coastline than the general straight line that Cook's chart published in 1784 depicted, that being the third map in our presentation here. Cook didn't spend much time along the Northwest coast because his instructions, as I recounted at some length in Captain Cook Rediscovered, it was perceived and generally known that any Northwest Passage could only be found in the high, icy latitudes, not in the mid-latitudes where, of course, the Columbia River emerges, where the Strait of Juan de Fuca can be found, etc. But the fur traders, such as Mears, found these intricacies and began to speculate that maybe these were openings that might augur the cartographic prospect, much like that very first map I presented, that one of them might lead to a great Western Bay, the French concept of the Mer de l'Ouest, or perhaps even reach all the way to Baffin Bay or Hudson Bay. And if you look closely, and again at the lower left of this chart, you can see that Mears's engraver to the inside of what looks like an intimation of Vancouver Island, and indeed it is that, writes the word the sea, And again, this is evoking that ancient, nearly ancient French cartographic notion that there was an analog to Hudson Bay that accessed the interior of the continent off the Pacific Ocean. Next slide. The maritime fur traders discovering that the West Coast was not the simple line that Cook had depicted, combined with the terrestrial fur traders moving west from Hudson Bay and from Montreal, Pond coming from Montreal, the Hudson Bay Company, the formal corporate entity moving westward from the bay itself, created a pincer movement. And in this map, published in 1794, we see the state of cartographic insight and perception of the northwest coast of North America on the eve of George Vancouver's voyage of exploration, which was launched in 1791, had 3 seasons of exploration, 1792, 93, 94. Now, as I said, this map was published in 1794, and it's the rarest of the maps in this slideshow. And I've only seen one version of this. This is from the Washington State Library here in Olympia. This map is very interesting, again, never having been published, because the engraver took Cook's chart from his atlas of 1784 and hammered the copper smooth so that he could re-engrave the Northwest coast in greater detail than Cook's mission allowed him to do. So, for example, in the left, you can see Cook's track through Bering Strait, where he struck ice on the northeast Alaska coast, reached over to the top of the Russian Far East, then exited back through Bering Strait, of course, headed down to the Aleutians briefly, and then ultimately to Hawaii, where he met his fate. But look at the detail of the Northwest coast. Of particular note, I think, to Pacific Northwest Historians Guild members would be the very suggestive early intimation in the lower right-hand corner of this image, one of the first cartographic depictions of what, in a normative sense, we would understand to be the Strait of Juan de Fuca. As David mentioned in his introduction, I'm doing another book on Juan de Fuca, but suffice to say, the fur traders were in some measure quite surprised to find a strait approximately where Fuca was rumored to have found one in 1592. But again, notice the very intricate coastline, very suggestive, again, hearkening back to Mears's chart, which dated just a few years earlier, that one or more of these openings might lead to the lakes and rivers that Peter Pond was depicting, and perhaps all the way to either Hudson Bay or Baffin Bay. And so therefore, the concept of the Northwest Passage was hereby going through an evolution. Again, to recapitulate, Frobisher, Baffin, Hudson from the Atlantic, Cook from the Pacific, they were all looking for a navigable, level water, saltwater route from the Pacific to the Atlantic, or the Atlantic to the Pacific, as the case may be, over the top of North America. Now the idea began to revert to that very first image, the French cartographic projection, that maybe there was a deep opening in the continent that would facilitate, if not a direct navigable route from the Atlantic to the Pacific and vice versa, at least a narrowing of North America that would limit the extent of the terrain that would have to be traversed by trade or by human beings across the center of North America. Next slide, please, Darlene. It was this ferment created by the maritime fur traders and the vast speculation about whether Cook was presumed to have decided once and for all there was no Northwest Passage, even in an evolved sense, in the mid-latitudes. The fur traders reopened that question, and so to resolve the matter once and for all, the British Admiralty dispatched George Vancouver to the Northwest coast in the years I noted earlier in this program, to, as I say, to answer the question once and for all. Cook's directions were pretty straightforward. He was to hit the North American continent in California, on the California coast, and basically, again, putting it in kind of colloquial terms, he was to keep the continent to his right until he exhausted all possible recourses for this second version of the Northwest Passage. And this chart that you see here, published in 1798, was the result of his effort. You can again see here, well, if you can perhaps pinch and get larger view of it, you can see the outfall of the Columbia River, so named by Robert Gray, but Vancouver ran into Gray off the coast of the Olympic Peninsula in the spring of 1792, and he would later send a ship up the Columbia, about 100 miles, about to where modern Vancouver, Washington is. You also now see for the first time a reasonable cartographic depiction of Puget Sound, and more particularly Admiralty Inlet. One of my pet peeves, it's not really a pet peeve, but it's the kind of thing that historians like to dwell on. The concept of Puget Sound has migrated north over the centuries. By Puget Sound, Vancouver meant the network of bays south of Tacoma Narrows, which you can see in this map. The larger body of water, what would consist of today Commencement Bay, Elliott Bay, Admiralty Inlet, all of that was Admiralty Inlet. Puget Sound was the most southernmost of the inland waters, now falling under the general rubric of the Salish Sea. Also, Vancouver was able to definitively establish the insular nature of Vancouver Island, seen here, what he called Quadra and Vancouver's Island, but through usage, Quadra was dropped for reasons that are perhaps readily imagined given our understanding of regional history. Vancouver stayed, and there again you can see the labyrinthine nature of the Inside Passage, the Southeast Alaskan coast, Queen Charlotte Islands, now known as Haida Gwaii, until you get far enough to the northwestern limit of this map, where again you see, as you did in Cook's map, the outline of Prince William Sound, Cook Inlet. The upshot of all of this, of course, as this chart more than suggests, is that the second version of the Northwest Passage did not exist either. So Cook, looking for ocean to ocean, blocked by ice. Fur traders, maritime and terrestrial, conjure a second cartographic image for the Northwest Passage. Vancouver proves that it doesn't exist earlier. But as I note, perhaps belabor in my forthcoming book, Discovering Nothing, the notion of a Northwest Passage, to use a French term, was such an idée fixe that geographers, those with commercial interest in global trade, simply would not let loose of the idea. And so therefore, the concept of the Northwest Passage moved to its third iteration. And that's where we'll move in our next slide. Alexander Mackenzie was Peter Pond's protege. Pond had fancied the notion of following some of his imagined rivers to Prince William Sound or Cook Inlet. But Pond was a notoriously fractious figure, rumored to have killed one or more of his partners in the field. And so he left the Athabasca district of what's now northern Alberta and the Northwest Territories, and turned over the terrain to his protege, Alexander Mackenzie, who decided to try to follow the outline that Pond had intimated in his writings and in his maps, one of which you saw earlier. Mackenzie left on his first attempt in 1789, but the river system he ended on, which is named after him, did not flow west into Prince William Sound or Cook Inlet. Instead, it reached what he somewhat hazily discerned as the Arctic Ocean. He returned not merely to his country headquarters, but to Montreal and even to Great Britain to learn scientific navigation more thoroughly, and made a second attempt in 1793. Departing again Lake Athabasca, he crossed, he hit the waters of what we know today as the Peace River, made it over the Cordillera, stumbled upon a southward flowing stream, which at the time he only knew by its indigenous name, Takuch-Tes, but which upon his return, he determined had to have been, or suspected was, the headwaters of the river that Gray and Vancouver had explored at about the same time. Again, Gray, Vancouver and the Northwest Coast, 1792. Mackenzie went to the Arctic, 1789, returned, and conducted a second voyage westward in 1793. And in fact, Vancouver and Mackenzie barely missed each other the summer of 1793. But much like what happened with Meriwether Lewis, Mackenzie had a profound case of writer's block and was not able to publish his account or include in that account this chart until Voyages from Montreal was published in 1801. Therefore, in the intervening years between 1793 and 1801, he came into the knowledge of Vancouver's chart of the Northwest Coast, which you can see fairly replicated along the Pacific Coast aspect of the image you see here. Perhaps the most significant aspect of Mackenzie's work was not his cartography, but a few concluding paragraphs in his narrative, Voyages from Montreal, at the end of which he states with considerable bravado that he thinks he's found or established a network that can carry trade from the Atlantic to Pacific by the nature of these rivers from the St. Lawrence, the Great Lakes, the rivers and lakes of central and western Canada. And that therefore he has not only discovered, mapped out the third version of the Northwest Passage, but that by developing this route, British interests might circumscribe the efforts of the Americans to establish a foothold on both the maritime fur trade and the terrestrial beaver trade, and that through a circling move, the British can kind of, let's say, preclude American entry to the Northwest Coast. It was those few paragraphs that prompted Thomas Jefferson, then president, to launch what became known as the Lewis and Clark Expedition, the American response. Next slide. To further Lewis's, and of course, originally it was conceived of as the Lewis Expedition. Lewis's best decision was to add William Clark to the team, and we'll get to Clark here shortly. But to expedite Lewis's work in the West, the War Department commissioned this map produced by a cartographer by the name of Nicholas King to aid Lewis's research, cartographic and geographic research in the field. To the right, of course, you will see the generally recognizable shape of Lake Michigan, Lake Superior. To the north and west of Lake Superior, you will now see the somewhat familiar outline of the lakes and rivers, the pond, and Mackenzie had begun to shape in pursuit of the terrestrial fur trade. On the west coast, you will see a perfect replication, quite honestly, of Vancouver's cartography, what we would know as the Oregon coast, the inland waters of Western Washington, the insularity of Vancouver Island, etc. But I call your attention in this image, again, with the aim of defining the evolution of the Northwest Passage. At the very center of this image, you will see the word conjectural. This was Nicholas King's expression in what Jim Ronda famously called the geography of hope. Notice how King has portrayed the Mississippi and the Missouri River slowly bending their way west, where they meet right at the crease in the fold of the original map, where they meet almost intersect with what King deems here and typifies as the conjectural South Fork of the Columbia River, where it which extending westward would meet the fork coming down from what would now be north central British Columbia. This, of course, was the fork that Mackenzie presumed to have discovered in 1793. Mackenzie, just as a side note, thought he was on the Columbia River when he published Voyages from Montreal, but what he had actually done was stumble upon the headwaters of the Fraser. But no one would know that until 1808 or later, when Simon Fraser finally made a run down the river that bears his name. But again, the important point here in terms of the evolution of the Northwest Passage as a cartographic image is in the southern portion of this map, where you see the upper extent of the Missouri neatly and conveniently and very hopefully interfacing with the conjectural South Fork of the Columbia River. Next slide. As we all know, nothing in the geography of the Northern West was as simple as that. This is Clark's map, published in 1814 with the publication of the Journals of Lewis and Clark, the so-called Biddle edition. And you have merely to contrast the previous image with this one to see that the American response, the American dream of replicating the already fanciful notion of a Northwest Passage of the Pond Mackenzie variety, you can see that notwithstanding their best attempts once they returned to St. Louis to convince Thomas Jefferson that they had found an American version of the Northwest Passage, the complex geography, principally of what we would now know as northern Idaho and Montana, completely precluded the prospect of the Northwest, a practicable Northwest Passage, relying on rivers, streams, lakes, etc., to fulfill the ancient dream. So, therefore, the first version of the Northwest Passage, the one Cook was sent to find, it didn't exist then, does now, but we'll come back to that. The second version, the one propagated by Mears and the fur traders and other speculative cartographers with a deep inland sea that narrowed the distance between Hudson Bay and the Mer de l'Ouest, Vancouver proved that doesn't exist. The third version, the Pond Mackenzie Lewis and Clark version, also impracticable. But again, the idea of the Northwest Passage was such a idée fixe that when nature refused to provide a Northwest Passage, one was built. Next slide, please. This is a chart from Isaac Stevens' Pacific Railroad report. Again, most of you would know the story of Stevens in general form, first territorial governor of Washington, simultaneously and somewhat conveniently for him and the federal government, also the Indian agent for Washington Territory. And thirdly, and less well known, is that Stevens came west as the leader of a U.S. Army-sponsored survey to establish the prospects for a northern transcontinental railroad route running from the upper Mississippi River Basin, Lake Superior, westward to Puget Sound. Now, Stevens was actually one of 4 surveyors sent out. But what is unique in that year by Congress under the War Department, headed not coincidentally by Jefferson Davis, I'll get to that perhaps. Stevens was one of the first 4 surveyors. He was tasked with the northern route. He had to get out there somehow anyway, so the government gave him the responsibility of surveying a railroad route, that technology having matured in the 1830s and 40s with the gold rush, the admission of California as a state in 1849, it was deemed now practicable to create an iron horse version of the Northwest Passage. But Stevens was unique among the 4 surveyors in that he completely and rather thoroughly and effectively, consciously, posed his scheme for a Northern Pacific Railroad as the latter-day version of the Northwest Passage, up to and including hydrological analyses of the various ports on Puget Sound, and in fact, a complete maritime history. He didn't write it himself. He commissioned it, and he envisioned, and he specifically positioned his railroad route as the realization of the long-sought dream. As I noted, Jefferson Davis was the Secretary of War. He was not at all interested in the northern route. That was kind of a sop to Douglas and other northern senators. Davis always wanted a southern route for a railroad to California and recommended such to Congress. But of course, this being the hypersectional era of the 1850s, no railroad could be built, no consensus could be established. The Central Line, Central Pacific, Union Pacific, would in fact be the first, but the second was the route generally surveyed by Isaac Stevens in the 1850s. Again, seen here, his chart from the Rocky Mountains on the right to what's now Western Washington, what was then Washington Territory, to the west on your left-hand side. Next slide. There was a corresponding development north of the border. Again, most of us would be conversant in the general outline. Canadian Confederation, I think I have this date correctly, occurred in 1866, or no, 1867, I'm sorry. Very shortly thereafter, out of fear that British Columbia might fall to the land-hungry Americans, the first Canadian Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, promised British Columbia that if they joined Confederation, he would have the Canadian government build a railroad from the Great Lakes, that is to say, Montreal, Toronto, westward across the Canadian Shield, the Canadian Prairies, across the Canadian Rockies, all the way to the inland waters, again, to what we now call the Salish Sea. Here you see a depiction of both the original route surveyed by Sir Sandford Fleming. This is the northern dotted line that went through Edmonton. Sandford Fleming is better known as the inventor of universal time, the 24 time zones, Greenwich being the prime meridian. But he was also a railroad survey. His line ended up not being built. William Cornelius Van Horn completed the CPR to what was then known as Port Moody, also in the 1880s, roughly at the same time the Northern Pacific was completed, just south of the 49th parallel. But I come back to Port Moody, which is still exists as a relatively minor jurisdiction in our neighboring province and country. But Van Horn thought that Port Moody was not a very dignified name for the terminus of the CPR. So he came up with the idea of naming the western terminus Vancouver, consciously evoking the long history of the Northwest Passage and the desire of a route over, around, or through North America, of which Vancouver's efforts were a part, and so therefore named the terminus city Vancouver in full reciprocation of the saga that I've spent much of the last hour attempting to recount. And so when nature failed to provide a Northwest Passage, one was built in the form of these and other railroads. And you have only to do like I did for many years from my office at the History Museum there in Tacoma and see train after train with hundreds of container cargo loads running to and fro to realize that the transcontinental railroads, the Union Pacific today, Burlington Northern Santa Fe, the CPR, the CN, they are in fact the land bridge. They effectively operate as the Northwest Passage across or through North America. Next slide. Of course, the idea of finally determining whether the classic version of the Northwest Passage, that is to say, the one that Cook was sent to find, that turned less into a practical utilitarian quest and more of a romantic, let's do it because it's there kind of thing, like climbing the summit of a mountain. And so, and again, this could be a whole story into itself, a whole talk into itself. Sir John Franklin figures prominently in this. His ship was marooned in the northern Canadian archipelago in the mid-1840s. Franklin himself failed to navigate the Northwest Passage in the Canadian North, but the disappearance of Franklin precipitated dozens of voyages sent to find him, many sponsored by the Royal Navy, some organized by Franklin's sponsor. One of them, by McClure, actually was able to kind of provide the outline of the Northwest Passage through the archipelago. Of course, it was not until 1906 when Roald Amundsen was after overwintering through 2 seasons in the north, was finally able to transect the Northwest Passage. However, as we all know, with the rapid recession of the Canadian ice pack, the Northwest Passage, the one that Cook was sent to find, in fact, if Cook were to sail where he tried to sail in 1778, he could probably get through to Baffin Bay. Couldn't then, could now, and so this last aspect of the mystery was finally defined in 1853 by McClure. Again, Amundsen was the first to make a Northwest Passage transect, ending in 1906. And ships and pleasure craft routinely make this passage now every summer. Indeed, some climate scientists believe that much of this water will be ice-free year-long, and perhaps even seasonally, the ice pole itself will be ice-free in the northern summer. So that is the story of the evolution of the Northwest Passage as a cartographic image. Last slide, Darlene. So began and end with an advertisement. So these are my books. The 2 on the left by UBC Press, the 2 from the right, WSU Press. Many of these maps, certainly all of these stories, are recounted in one or the other of these publications. At this point, David, I think I'll take a deep breath, a swig of water, and see if there are any questions.
Wow, thank you. That was a wonderful, wonderful talk. I have spent a good part of my last 10 or 12 years of my life thinking about that part of the world and being amazed by it. And it was just so wonderful to hear how you connected so many dots of the story and really, helped frame this long-time quest for this vision, this dream, if you will. So I really want to thank you for that. So a variety of questions. So one of them was the sea otter pelt market the Far East and the beaver pelt market Eastern New York City and Europe, or did both products have demand in both geographic markets?
That's a great question. The beaver trade tended to move east towards Montreal, New York, and to Great Britain. The sea otter trade by way of Hawaii and Alaska went in and out of the Chinese markets, where it was exchanged for tea, porcelain, and other rare goods, and then through a triangular trade sort of system conveyed alternatively to the Atlantic seaboard of America or to Great Britain. So the 2 trade systems kind of butted heads with each other along the Pacific Rocky Mountain Cordillera, but they actually served markets in opposing directions, but they were one and the same fur trade.
Okay, interesting. So observation, sort of maybe a question, observation. So these maps that you show are basically the pre-colonial intertribal trade networks, as noted by the white guys who, quote unquote, discovered them.
Yes, I have a cautionary note in Discovering Nothing that in some sense, these individuals rarely, if ever, discovered anything. And that's, of course, intended by the somewhat ironic title of the very book, Discovering Nothing. Not only did these explorers frequently fail to find what they were looking for, what they did find had been discovered by others earlier. So the point is well made, but we all work with a normative understanding of the world's geography, and these people helped frame that image and the imperial consequences of its various iterations, I think, makes for an interesting story nonetheless.
Yeah. So here's a long question. I'll see if I'll just read it out, and there's sort of, it boils down to in the end. And it gets back to the whole idea of maps. Can you speak to how cartographic information was transferred across competing parties? For example, English navigational power with interests blocking the French, Spanish, and nascent US from encroaching on what they held to be crowns, the HBC that acted as a semi-independent government agency, early US Navy, the earlier Russian and Spanish navigators. Geo-competition would seem to encourage secrecy and inhibiting publishing of these maps and knowledge, yet commercial interests may have encouraged sharing. So basically, can you speak of how information flowed from navigators and explorers to their quote unquote competition?
Yeah, that's a very well-made point. If you recall the second chart that Darlene put up, and maybe Darlene can in fact go all the way back to it, slide 3, but map 2. Some scholars suspect, nope, not that one, Darlene.
I'll get it. I'll get it.
There. Some scholars have argued that the Russians mystified geographic information precisely to keep imperial interlopers, as they might have thought of them, the Spanish, the British in particular, from finding their way through and around these waters. In other words, this map is so at variance with normative geographic understanding that and it completely confounded Captain Cook. He could not make any, this was supposedly the most modern version of the North Pacific. Cook couldn't make any sense of it. And it frustrated him to a great deal, because he was operating on the premise that map makers would be attempting to elucidate geography, not to mystify it. But as I say, other scholars have suggested the Russians went out of their way to obscure their geographic understanding with completely misleading images like this. I really can't add to the larger balance of the observation, because it's true. It took a long time after the wake of a voyage for the cartography to be published. Let's just take a couple of for instances. Cook is on the Northwest coast in 1778. His chart isn't published until 1784. Vancouver's in these waters in 1792, 93, 94. The chart isn't published until 1798. Mackenzie doesn't publish the map of his route until almost 15 years after his first voyage to the Arctic. So there's a significant lag time running concurrently with this almost feverish desire to penetrate these regions in order to capitalize on the fur trade. So it was a very confusing, chaotic scene, and the quest for geographic information dominated a lot of national policy making, which of course is what led to these voyages to begin with, the same one in the same quest.
Yeah, an interesting answer. I mean, in some senses, one might wonder why there aren't more misleading official maps published, to mislead, to hide territory that people thought was valuable. I mean, so in a sense, yeah, that it's sort of astounding that so many were published as accurately. And again, I'm guessing ties to ego and nationalism and claims for land as people are taking land from obviously indigenous people. So, but Jim, I see you popped onto the screen. How are you doing on time? We're at 8. Do you want to?
Well, do you have any more questions?
There's one more question. I'll go with.
Let's do it.
The first book I remember reading as a child in the 1950s was Northwest Passage by Kenneth Roberts. But I think the book has nothing to do with what you've talked about. Perhaps it reflects the lingering of the E-Day fix. Any comment?
Well, I would maintain that we still live with the E-Day fix. The notion of the Northwest Passage still has kind of a grip on the popular and commercial imagination. There is, of course, an analog above Russia and Siberia. It's called the Northern Sea Route. which both Russia and China are capitalizing, particularly in this day and age. Much of the hydrocarbon stock of Russia is making its way to China through the Northern Sea route, also by way of pipeline. And in terms of the Northwest Passage, it's still a matter of international contention as to whether the Northwest Passage, that is to say, that several paths through the northern Canadian archipelago, are international waters or not. The United States maintains that it is. Canada is kind of ambivalent about it, and Arctic tourism and mining of various sorts in Greenland, Baffin Island, to say nothing of hydrocarbons. There's still a lot of ferment of a quasi-imperial commercial variety. There's still a lot of ferment in the north, which is a continuation of the story that now dates back a couple hundred years.
Interesting. So I'm going to take one last sort of quick question. It looks like I can't tell if it's quick or not, but Bill Woodward writes, didn't you, I assume you is referring to David Nicandri, years ago make the point that the findings of Malaspina and other Spanish voyagers were suppressed in the Spanish archives to maintain an advantage, but Cook et al. Were deliberately published for both imperial and scientific reasons? Do I recall correctly, he writes?
Yes, Bill's right about that. And that would have been another example that I could have given because not everyone not every nation was as open with their cartographic understanding as Great Britain was. Of course, Great Britain had an imperial/commercial reason for doing so, to further commercial interest, homegrown and otherwise. The Russians wanted to keep their foothold on North America, the Aleutian Islands, as secret as long as they could. The Spanish, dating back to the 16th century, going back even further, held the notion that the whole Pacific Basin was entirely under the one of the nefarious aspects of the doctrine of discovery, maintained claim to the entire Pacific Basin. So their geographic findings took a long time in coming to light. So Bill is absolutely right about that. The Northwest Passage, though, although other nations engaged in it, the French, the Russians to a degree, although coming from a different direction, the Americans in respect, but the Northwest Passage and the Franklin story up in the Arctic figures prominently in this. It held a particular grip on the imagination of geographers, real and hypothetical, in Great Britain. So to a significant degree, the Northwest Passage is a British discovery, which is why Roald Amundsen, not only being the first to transect, being a Norwegian, being the first to transect the Northwest Passage in 1906, and then having the affront also to beat Robert Falcon Scott to the South Pole a few years later, was a real blow to the British self-image as hardy explorers. So the competition among nations and the variegation in their motivations figures prominently in this story.
Well, I would, as the program person, just want to thank you immensely, Dave and Darlene, for sharing, for telling such an amazing and compelling story. And I will now pass it back to our esteemed yellowish leader.
You really? And as president, I can officially decree that it was time well spent. Many thanks. And one of the good things is not only do we learn a lot, we also learn about David's books. And then with the introduction that David Williams gave, it sounds like a lot of people should read the books to learn how to properly write a book. So I recommend them to you. Now, remember, everybody, a fourth Thursday of the month, March 28th, we'll be back. Danica Miller will be talking about a very interesting part of history for the Puyallup tribe down in Tacoma. And with that, thank you, everybody, for attending and submitting some very interesting questions. And thank you, David. And Best to all. Good night.
Good
Night.
night.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Darlene.